So I'm here with a good friend of mine, and we're getting ready to step into our third era. We've been going back to the very first session that we had on Monday, would have been really just painting the picture of that first 1600 years of church history, and then we stepped into that first era of modern missions. With that second era, we had John Joseph with us, really pulling apart a bit of Hudson Taylor's life and what that particular era looked like. And now I've got a good friend of mine, Joshua Statham. We actually work together here in Birmingham, and Josh was probably one of the most unique people I've ever met. He's got a brain like Fort Knox. Anything that goes into there, it's like it's in there and it's never going away. I don't know how he's able to pull back from the recesses of his mind the information that he has, but probably one of the most knowledgeable individuals I've ever met. He's been in Youth with a Mission for about 15 years now. Did your DTS in 05?
06.
06.
So 14-ish.
Denver, Colorado?
Yeah.
Denver, Colorado. So he's been in the mission for a while now, worked at several different bases, Colorado, and then down in Las Vegas, helping pioneer some work down there, and then in Colorado again after that, and now here in Birmingham, and then you guys are getting ready to take off for Central Asia.
Yeah, we just couldn't stand working with you guys any longer. So.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you at all.
It's just the humidity. Yeah, so we're looking forward to whatever the next chapter looks like. So
yeah,
it was like most things with God, a bit unexpected, but I'm sure it'll be exciting. So.
Awesome. So you have, unfortunately, I don't know, how could I put this? Fortunately and unfortunately, you have probably one of the most exciting yet boring eras to talk about when we're talking the first three modern eras of world missions. You've got the third era of missions. Maybe just start unpacking a little bit for us. I know that this would be referred to, correct me if I'm wrong, the ethno-linguistic era, or that would be kind of one way of looking at it. We're no longer focusing on the coastlands like we were in the first era, and we're no longer focusing purely on the inlands like we were in the second era, but now we've broken it down into people groups and languages, and I'm sure it goes a lot deeper than that.
Yeah, it is. I mean, from one perspective, it is kind of a bit more dry than the first two eras. But at the same time, so much more interesting, like, because there's just so much more complexity that's going on in the third era, which for me, that makes it more exciting in some ways. You know, it's like you got to figure out where all the puzzle pieces go. But
I'm like, just tell me the stories.
Yeah,
just give me the stories.
Stories are great, and I totally understand that. And Jesus was awesome at mixing the two, right? Being able to captivate people with the stories, but slap them across the face with the truth and reality of behind that story. And so, but yeah, the first two eras were a bit more story driven for sure. But I think part of that is because there's really specific missionaries that we really hone in on, and their personal stories either inspire us or frighten us, you know, to either draw us to missions or send us running the other direction. So yeah, there's awesome stories in the first two waves. I mean, incredible stories in the first two waves. But then when we switch gears to the third wave, there's like this pause. Yeah. It's like the church isn't just shifting gears during this season, like it's adding new gears.
If you can see, the numbers all go to 11.
Does that mean it's louder? Is it any louder?
Well, it's one louder, isn't it?
We're going into overdrive in ways that we weren't even aware existed, really, in the first two. I'm not saying there was ignorance in the church, or there might have been some really, future-oriented, missionaries on the field that really saw possibilities or what was coming down the pipe. But for the most part, I think the third wave kind of shocked everyone.
Yeah.
And due to some of the geopolitical realities in the world at the time, there was literally a pause. There was a shifting where we could not engage in the Great Commission straight out of Wave 2 in the way that we were probably hoping or looking forward to.
Okay.
There was literally a pause, and I think in those down seasons, we all think and ponder and seek the face of God. Yeah. And God, what are you saying in this season? What are you preparing us for? What's coming next? And if we're listening, God gives us some pretty incredible understanding and expectations even. And so I really enjoy the third wave because there was that pause and shifting of gears, and it was a long pause. I can imagine if I were alive during the first really much of the beginning of that wave, I would have been a little stir crazy because things were not moving at the pace that we were even coming out the tail end of the second wave.
Yeah. So around what time frame would this have been?
Yeah. So all of these waves, you have to realize there's overlap.
Yeah.
And so as one wave builds and crests and then begins to fall off, that's really when an undercurrent happens and the next wave begins to build. And so you have some crossover. And so it's by the time the previous wave has really lost its steam and momentum, that's kind of
downward,
hitting the bottom. That's when the next wave has already then built its momentum, kind of had its foundations laid, and key people kind of added to the mix, and then it's taking off. So, but for the third wave, we're looking at the official dates that we kind of pinned to it are the 1930s through the 2000s.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting season of world history. Coming out of...
So that pause would have been World War
World War
One.
World War One had finished. We were getting ready for World War II. And so some of that pause, definitely wasn't spiritual in nature. I mean, in terms of it wasn't like the church deciding to take a break and, hey, let's gather our thoughts and prepare for the next wave. Wouldn't
it be great if the church had that much unity just to be able to do something like that?
And that much foresight, so we were in this interesting season where even if there was an impetus, even if there was a driving force and mechanism within the church to go out and hit the streets again, we couldn't. The world just was in chaos, and things were not getting better. World War One, the war to end all wars, and so we thought, oh, this is as bad as it gets. Surprise, no, it gets much worse. And so I think a lot of people were caught off guard by that. And I'm sure there were a lot of missionaries on the field, still on the field from the previous wave, who just were not expecting the carnage and the chaos, that was in that season.
Wow.
And but interestingly, one of we'll talk about kind of the three big names, not all of them, but the three big names that kind of identify this wave. At the outsets of that, the first one we would talk about would be Donald McGavran, and he really was kind of that transitional person from the second wave to the third wave. He was influenced by John R. Mott and the student volunteer movement, and so it was an interesting transition because you are coming from really in the first two waves, although they're coastlands and inlands is kind of how we talk about them, but really the shift that happens then from 1 and 2 to the third wave is really an understanding of missions in talking about places, is shifting to talking about people. From places to people. And so that's when this understanding, not a new understanding, but kind of re-understanding that people groups are what we're really needing to target, not geopolitical entities, not geographical borders.
So we missed something, in the first and second era when Jesus said every tribe, tongue, and language. We kind of that get put on the back burner somehow.
Somehow, I don't know if they misinterpreted that as much as we had gone through several hundred years in the Protestant church without doing anything really in missions. And so I don't want to say that they misunderstood the text as much as they were having to pioneer something and put something together which did not really previously exist. And in any entrepreneurial or pioneering season, you're not necessarily shooting for perfection right out of the gate. You're just trying to get something out there. And I think that's kind of the process that the church as a whole went through. It's like, we just need to get people out there.
Do something.
Just do anything, It's spiritual triage. The world is waiting. We've done nothing. Let's get anyone and everyone who's even willing out on the field. So I have great respect for those guys who were willing to do that. And then after we kind of got those boots on the ground, then we had the time to, especially during World War I and II, we kind of had the time to think and kind of refine those processes and those systems. What is the most effective way that we can do this, rather than just throwing people onto the field and thinking in terms of geography and geopolitical borders. So, but
they thought the first era, second era, they thought strategically what would happen was minister to the coastlands. They'll move inwards.
Yeah, there was
coastal people just don't move inwards.
Yeah, there was definitely thought that went into it. It was also the most logical progression, right? It's just, we have to think in terms of just even transportation. You know, like it was really difficult to go anywhere. You know, back in the 1700s, it took a long time. Lots of people died even in transit, you know, and so the coastlands made the most sense. That's where we have the easiest access. But the thought was, the leavened bread, analogy. We'll just get a little bit of Christianity in that geopolitical country, and that little lump will spread like wildfire. So I think it was logical and biblical. It was biblical. It's not that they were, out in left field. The problem was it just didn't work. It didn't work the way they thought it would. Shocker. Plans of man don't go according to how we thought they would. Man plans, God laughs, right? So they just started kind of problem solving and figuring out like what is the thing that is keeping this from spreading, and that kind of led then to a greater understanding of ethno-linguistic groups, people groups. So it's interesting that the kind of the crossover name was Donald McGavran, because he was influenced by John R. Mott, student volunteer movement, who were very much focused on inlands, right? He went to India, and so it's amusing to me that probably India, of all places, was probably the best location to start to begin to understand the concept of people groups, because there are so many. And so I think that was kind of the first petri dish, if you will, to kind of begin to understand, like, oh, wow, I can't just come to India and preach the gospel, because there's a million different people groups here who speak different languages, have different culture, have different customs, different traditions, different religions or perspectives of that religion. It was India is a really confusing place, and so I think it's pretty fitting that God seems to kind of use that as the launch point, if you will, for that new understanding and the third wave. But then as we move beyond Donald McGavran, then we get into William Cameron Townsend, who was a linguist. He's the guy who started Wycliffe, and so he had a mind for that. He was already thinking in terms of language groups, and then that just naturally follows then the people who are attached to those language groups. So he really began that transition in earnest from places to people. But then it was Ralph Winter then in the 1970s that really cemented those concepts and really put them out in the greater church culture at large, to where everyone, when I say everyone, I don't mean like this was being preached at every local church, but like the broader body of Christ was definitely then more aware of these concepts. When he really put forth that presentation in the 1970s, Billy Graham invited him to a conference in Lausanne, Switzerland. I think it was 1974. And so Ralph Winter really championed that. And so he really put that on everyone's radar. Unreached people groups, UPGs, as we call them. And also breaking down the historical divide between the local church and the missions church, or what he coined the terms of the sodality and the modality. And so it was really the 1970s where this wave really began to build steam. And that sounds like there was a big pause, because there was. Again, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, things were just not moving full steam ahead for the church in that season. So when we talk about it began in the 1930s and ran into the 2000s, that's true. That is technically true, but the reality was it really didn't gain steam and launch out into the world until after the 1970s. And even then, it didn't really gain steam until the fall of communism. When the world shifted out of 89, 90, when the world shifted out of a multipolar or bipolar world at that time, bipolar between USSR, USA. Once the Cold War really ended and we had a stable, relatively stable unipolar moment in the world again, boom, this thing just took off. And so that's probably one of the most amazing seasons in church history that we have ever experienced, was really 1990 through 2000. 1 decade. Wow. Blew everyone's mind. So.
Okay, so you mentioned that we saw this kind of brewing or build-up phase from the 30s on through 70s, 80s, and then kind of the 90s, late 80s, 90s, missions explodes. Right? We see more salvations, more missions work being done in that decade than the previous all of history combined, correct? Something along those lines.
Yeah, it was absolutely mind-boggling. It's almost, speaking in terms of explosions, like the first wave was a stick of dynamite. The second wave was, a barrel. But the third wave went nuclear. That really, in terms of the exponential growth that we hit, we really have to think of that. It was the bomb that changed the world, you know. So we have to realize that in the grand scheme of things, when we're looking at all of missions history, the last 2,000 years, percentage-wise, the early church did a bang-up job. Like, the gospel was going out in power. So they went from essentially 0%, the world being Christian, to about 20% of the known world being Christian in those 400-ish years before the fall of the Roman Empire. So that was an enormous jump, percentage-wise. But in terms of sheer numbers, it was relatively small. Because the world population was relatively small. I mean, at the time of Christ, the entire world population was probably about 160, 190 million people. So when you get into the first modern era of missions in the 1700s, like the curve had just started to pick up. We were this really gradual increase for literally, the previous 1700 years. And then coincidentally, when missions really started to pick up, that's when births started to pick up. Now, this isn't a conspiracy theory. There's other channels you can tune into for those, but in terms of the sovereignty of God, and that He chose the time and dates and places where men would be born, where they would live, like that's a foreign concept for most of us, because we steer far typically from determinism and into free will, which I'm totally for. I understand that, but at the same time, God is clearly up to something here. Like, humanity was down here for so long, and then the moment where missions really start to make an impact, suddenly that's when more humans start living on the face of the earth. So the way I would phrase that is that God has so ordained the world and has had such a hand in history that it wasn't until the gospel could be preached that man could be born. That like populations could really start swelling to where of all the people who will ever live on the face of the planet, coincidentally started to live when access to the gospel had really taken off. And that is a strange coincidence, that I believe God had an ace up his sleeve. He was tinkering with the mechanisms there a bit, I think. So it's really interesting to ponder, though, because we tend to think a lot of young people actually, and old people alike, we tend to demonize God. We tend to think of him as not righteous, not just, not fair, not loving, because we project on him, our own experiences and our own parents and authorities, et cetera, et cetera. And so we kind of tend to think that somehow all the people that died in the Old Testament era, or even in areas of the world where the gospel has not been, it's like, God, that's not fair, But the reality is, man, there is something going on where God actually has put his thumb on the scales, if you will, to ensure that the vast majority of people who have ever been born lived in an era where they had increased access to the gospel. And that just blows my mind.
Hey guys, so I'm in the middle of editing this video right now. I'm actually sitting in a car on my way up to Washington, D.C. You can see, got a full vehicle. But as I was going through the footage, I realized I didn't really leave a place right in here where we could really pull apart and kind of discuss. And so I'm gonna throw some time up here on the screen, and I want you guys to dive into a little bit of what we just talked about here. So this idea of population hitting a place of almost critical mass, where we see mass explosions of the population rate coinciding, we're about to go off the road too, coinciding with the beginning era of modern missions. So I want us to talk about this idea of the sovereignty of God, and talk about this idea of have you ever thought about it this way, that at the same exact time when we see exponential growth in population globally is the same exact time we see the spread of Christianity through the first era of missions. So I'm going to put a couple minutes up on the clock, grab your neighbor, just begin to talk with them. Is this something that you've seen before? Is this an aspect of the sovereignty of God you've pulled apart before? And from there, what are your thoughts? Go for it.
The atomic bomb fell in the third wave. We'd been throwing sticks of dynamite before, but then suddenly something happened, and during that decade from 1990 to the year 2000, where we hit our mission's peak during that wave, millions and millions and millions of people came into the kingdom. And by conservative estimates, more people came into the saving knowledge of Christ in that 10 years than the previous 1990 combined.
Wow.
And so it is incredible.
So I want us to pull apart a little bit of that, because I want us to understand a little bit more of, okay, we know that there was this massive boom, right? The early 90s, all of a sudden this third wave, we're focusing on people groups instead of places. We know there's this massive boom. And I know there have to be a lot of details into why, and we've been slowly picking little aspects of why that could be. I want us to dive in a little bit more. But you mentioned something a little bit ago when you were talking about Ralph Winter and this idea of the modality, sodality. Do you want to pull? I have a feeling that there's a vast majority of believers all over the world that have no idea. That was just completely over most of our heads. So what is this idea of a modality, sodality?
Interestingly, that was like my first big aha moment when I came into YWAM.
Yeah.
Literally, I think within the first couple months of coming on staff into YWAM, I think it was actually my base director who handed me like Ralph Winter's, 11-page article or whatever it was on the two structures of the church. I had no idea what I was about to read.
Yeah.
You know, but I read it, and it blew my mind. I'm like, wow, this makes so much sense. And I was like, why have I never heard this before? You know, is that huge light bulb going off over my head, and so it was really interesting. It was literally one of the first things that I really grappled with, you know, coming into YWAM. So for me, just because of that was my story, that was my journey. That was one of the first things I seemed to really learn when I came on staff. I kind of forget that not everyone has had that same journey.
Yeah.
Not everyone had that article handed to them as kind of like staff orientation, you know?
Yeah.
I think we should. Like,
That's a great idea.
That'd be a great primer for everyone coming into the mission.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of YWAMers struggle with identity.
Yeah.
Like, what is this? Who are we? What are we doing?
Jinx bought me a Coke. Oh, snap, man, we're still saying the same thing. This is amazing. Carrots, pumpernickels, glow sticks, twins.
Why are we doing it, you know? And
why are they doing it? What are they doing? What should I be doing?
So it was absolutely set the stage for me to really understand who we were as a mission and why we were so crazy. You know, why we did the things so differently from the local church, you know, which was every one of our, for the most part, entry point into YWAM. Most people who come into YWAM have first experienced the local church, and then YWAM is when they kind of have to shift gears and understand this weird organization that operates nothing, you know, like the local church.
Yeah.
And so Ralph Winter really laid that out for not just us, for everyone. Now, YWAM came onto the scene in the 1960s. Ralph Winter gave this presentation in the 70s in Lausanne, Switzerland. And so, we were a baby organization kind of when those concepts really were starting to gain traction.
Yeah.
So I think YWAM and several other organizations as well, but we kind of had the benefit of that.
Yeah.
Of kind of coming into age, if you will, as an organization with a little bit better understanding of the historical reality and the biblical reality of these two structures. So just in a nutshell, Ralph Winter coined the term sodality and modality. Not everyone appreciates those terms. They're not self-explanatory at all. So most people will refer to them as local church and mobile church, or local church and missions church. But the idea was that there was this interesting dynamic that took place at the Protestant Reformation. A lot of what happened during the Protestant Reformation was beneficial. Give the man credit there. But one of the things, no one is perfect though. So one of the things that Martin Luther kind of dropped the ball on, if you will, was this whole understanding of the two structures of the church. That God actually, now we are one, we're in unity. This is like Trinity, theology here. God is one, but he's also three persons. In the same way, the church is one, but also two different entities or two different structures. And so, but ironically, Martin Luther was a member of the mission church, of the monastic order, right? And in Roman Catholicism, you had these two structures preserved, right? You had the local parish, and you had the monastic order. And interestingly, even in Catholicism, I don't want to say there was power games at play or politics. That would be a little uncharitable, but definitely, if someone could pull rank, it was the monastic order who was calling the shots. Like, they were really the ones who were leading the broader entity of the Catholic Church. They were the pioneers and the thought shapers and the policy makers and the movement makers, if you will, of the Catholic Church. But that wasn't something they created. Catholic Church did come up with some rather unbiblical concepts during their time, but this wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
Like this, actually, they faithfully
Yeah.
mirrored what the early church had done, and the early church had mirrored faithfully what the Jewish faith had already established.
Yeah.
And so in the Jewish faith, and we see this clearly, even in the Old Testament, stories that everyone knows,
Yeah.
like Jonah. What was Jonah? Was he a local priest? No, he was not. But what was he then? Well, he was this guy who was actually sent out
Yeah.
into the world to speak truth, and so we see hints of this
Yeah.
in the Old Testament, even as lay people, reading just Bible stories,
Yeah.
children's Bible stories. Like we see hints of this, but we don't connect the dots,
Yeah.
and see the broader structures that were in place here. Jewish Old Testament, you had these two structures of the synagogue. You had
Yeah.
the local priests,
Yeah.
but then you also had what we would commonly just call the traveling rabbis.
Yeah.
So within those two categories, you had sodality and modality. You had local church, if you will, and mobile church. And this is very apparent then when we get to Jesus, because
Yeah.
of course he was not a local priest.
Yeah.
He was a traveling rabbi. But a lot of times we kind of think of Jesus as the guy who pioneered that model,
Yeah.
rather than the guy who came in and just plugged into an existing model. So he was definitely radical. Don't get me wrong. He had definitely some unconventional ideas at the time, but that wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
He was very conventional
Yeah.
in that sense. He was just plugging in, doing the thing that everyone would have
priests and elders,
expected
yeah.
him to do. He said things people didn't expect him to say, but he did things in terms of walk out that model that
Yeah.
everyone expected.
The whole eat my flesh, drink my blood thing.
Yeah.
I think that freaks some people out.
It might have, yeah. But when Jesus came along and started recruiting disciples, like that was not
Yeah.
new. They understood
Yeah.
what he was asking of them, and it was asking a lot. But it was also there was some prestige
Yeah.
that was associated with that, especially for some fishermen, or tax collectors or people of not so high up on the social pecking order. It was an honor for a traveling rabbi to come along and say, "Come follow me. Like I'm going to make you a disciple." Still challenging.
Yeah.
Again, just like it's the Indiana Jones in all of us. Like,
Yeah.
ooh, that looks so awesome. Wow, that's a lot to ask. At the same time. So for them to just drop their nets and follow him still was incredible.
Yeah.
They were willing to just at the drop of a hat
Yeah.
make that decision. But in terms of what he was asking them, it was not foreign to them.
Yeah.
They were very familiar with this method, this model, this structure. Then fast forward to the apostles, right?
Yeah.
And they carried
Continued
out
doing
that
that, yeah.
exact same model. Interestingly, the early church, much of their success can really be attributed to not only the geopolitical stability that Rome provided, the unipolar moment of that season, but also the fact that the Jewish synagogue had already permeated the Roman Empire at that point. Like synagogues had
Yeah.
already been planted in just about every nook
Wow.
and cranny
Yeah.
of the Roman Empire. And so Paul and Peter and Apollos and others,
Yeah.
they didn't have to go out and pioneer new churches. They
Yeah.
just went
Went
to
to
existing
existing
synagogues
synagogues,
and converted
Yeah.
those people into Christians and turned them into churches.
Yeah.
So there was a big explosion of church growth
Yeah.
during that season, but it was built on the backs of the Jewish methods and models and systems and structures and networks
Yeah.
that had already existed. And so then Martin Luther comes along in the Catholic tradition, which had carried over that
Yeah.
faithfully, biblically.
We have the Protestant movement.
And then you have the
develops.
Protestant Reformation, though. And I can't speak to Luther's motives.
Yeah.
Can't judge the man. I have no idea if this was an accident by purpose, if there
Yeah.
was, why exactly this happened. my sneaking suspicion is because it was a Reformation and he was pushing back against a lot of abuses and injustices and unbiblical ideas and theologies that the Catholic Church had. My guess is being part of the monastic order and seeing some of the abuses and unbiblical ideas and practices that had been established, he probably threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
And he's like, I just don't have anything to do with this, you know. And so at that point, he kind of dropped the monastic order or the mobile church or the missions church altogether and overreacted and went just to local church. This is it. Yeah. Everything is going to be done here. And that's going to be the model moving forward. Now, again, I don't know how much of that was intentional, accidental, byproducts, theological oopses. I don't know, you know, but that's definitely the result that we got. And so then we went into the Protestant era.
Hundreds of years of just following that model. Then.
Following that model where we shifted. I mean, this is a dramatic shift from a sending model to make disciples to an attractional model to make disciples.
Yeah.
And so really it was the Protestant Reformation that kind of shifted, at least in Protestant Christianity, shifted the mentality, really planted the seeds, I would say, for the whole seeker-sensitive church model. You know, of like, no, we just need to make our church more attractive to people so that they show up to our Sunday morning worship service so that we can preach the gospel to them. Yeah. That was a huge shift from the biblical model. Go and make disciples.
And that is where, when we're pulling apart this idea of the third era being very powerful and very explosive when it comes onto the scene, part of what Ralph Winter is saying is, hey, let's remember our early model. Let's remember our original biblical model.
Let's go back to our roots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's basically what I'm hearing. This idea for modality, sodality 101 it really is this idea of the missions church and the local church. It's always been there. That's how God originally created it to be, and it got separated. Around Protestant
got separated, church. And therefore both entities
suffered,
lost some of their potency and effectiveness. Well, I mean, local church lost some of its potency, and mission church got nixed altogether. I mean, it didn't even really exist for several hundred years. Then as we progressed through those really uncomfortable, you know, like puberty years, if you will, growing through that, really awkward because the local church viewed this newfangled, you know, rebellious upstart, you know, as kind of being what they coined their term was a parachurch organization, you know, something that is not the church, something else that comes alongside the church. And that's really a very unbiblical way to look at this. It's not the church versus another entity that's helping the church. It is the church. We are both equal partners not equal in numbers. Like even when this model was functioning properly, the numbers are always heavily in the local church's favor. There has to be. I mean, by necessity, by design, there has to be more senders than sendees, right? Otherwise, you can't sustain the system. If we're too heavy on the sendee, then we don't have enough people to send them. You have to have finance. You have to have supporters. You have to have people who are being mentored and brought up to function in societies there to disciple those spheres, which I know Fred will get into in the fourth wave. So like that understanding is critical. Like we can't become so focused on missions church that we blow it out of proportion and think this is where everything happens. No. Like local church is critical in this design and in their function. So both have their place. The local church is always going to be bigger. by necessity. It has to be that way. It's like 99.98%, of believers. It's that 0.02% that go out into the mission church in the traditional sense of like going overseas. Again, we're shifting that in the fourth wave, and things are going to get really exciting and really crazy. Yeah, exactly. In that season, as more traditions of men kind of break down, and we get back to an even greater biblical understanding of how the church, people-wise, not institution-wise, is called to disciple people.
It's good.
But there was this shift in our understanding. We came back to the biblical model. Ralph Winter really planted that flag, in the ground and said, "This is our history. This is what Scripture says. This is what early church history says. This is even what the Catholic, what they carried on in their tradition. Like, this is all so painfully obvious. Why did we stray from this method and this model?"
So we've got this idea of the modality. That's a huge aspect of why we've seen this explosion that took place in this third era of missions. What would be some of, if you could point to a couple different things that were taking place in this era, what would be some of those big things that were taking place that we say this definitely produced this massive thrust of missionaries going?
In the third wave, we had the benefit of the broader society, the culture that we lived in at the time, for the most part, had a biblical worldview. That was to our advantage, obviously. As we moved out of World War I, World War II, into the 50s, then, right after World War II, our society shifted from being in a season of crisis into a societal high, right? Everything was firing full blast, during the 50s and 60s. And so that really shifted even the mission sending, to America, because partially because America survived World War II to a much greater extent than the rest of the world did. We didn't have to rebuild from the ashes as much. So there was a geopolitical shift that took place. The geopolitic center of the world shifted from Europe over to America, and then uncoincidentally, the church kind of shifted. The mass shifted, and the church in America began to be kind of the leader in global Christianity. And so, because our society, during that societal high, for about 20-25 years, these last, the 50s through the 70s, our society, I mean, you can go back and look at the surveys, like people they were much more biblically literate back then. Family unit was intact for the most part. Like, there were family values, like out of wedlock births and divorce rates were very low, because we had as a society, we actually, even if you didn't necessarily identify as a born-again Christian, or even if you had never technically spent much time reading a Bible, like, it was so inculcated into the culture at large that you were brought up with that cultural understanding. And so out of that, we had a biblical framework as a culture, as a society. And therefore, when we were saved, when individuals did give their lives to the Lord, and they did commit themselves to discipleship, at some point there was understanding of the command to go. And it didn't take much to motivate people then from that position of understanding to action, because they understood the value of simple obedience.
So within the third era, would you mentioned one of the things that we had talked about earlier in one of the previous eras, the quote that was given to William Carey of, you know, son, if God wanted the heathen saved, he'd do it himself, right?
Yeah.
And so there was definitely, even in his generation, there's a bit of pushback, an anti-missions pushback.
Yeah.
And we saw even with Hudson Taylor, there was this, he was a bit younger when he tried originally going, and there's this, for him, against him personally, there was this not necessarily for him anti-missions, it was this you're not prepared.
Yep. Timothy dilemma.
Exactly.
Too young, too stupid, too inexperienced.
Exactly. And so within this third generation, because I see it right now, and I think it's something that you're alluding to and talking about as well, where we currently sit, there's very much an anti-missions sentiment that is being pushed very strongly.
For sure.
Historic, current, and future. Right? We're just trying to cover the entire gambit. It's all bad. There's never been anything good that's come from this, right?
And a lot of that sentiment actually, yeah, you're right. It's always been there.
Yeah.
But really, during the third wave, this kicked up into overdrive.
That was my question.
It was just what happened during this period in the academy, in you know, higher institutions of learning and education, was this social anthropological perspective of cultural criticism, you know, and really coming against this notion of ethnocentrism, the colonial, you know, model that the academy was really pushing back against. And some of that was valid, some of it was, you know, a reaction. But this notion that, you know, Western culture should not be just going out into the world and perpetuating or trying to duplicate Western culture, right? And so in you know, cultural anthropology, you would have anthropologists go out into the sticks, you know, and engage with these different people groups, and it was the cardinal sin, you know, to force your culture on these indigenous peoples, you know. And so, you know, due to the obvious overlap of cultural anthropology and missions work, you know, a lot of overlap there. I have a degree in anthropology myself. Coincidentally, not planned at all. It's just how God... I had no idea God was calling me into missions at the time. But there's definitely a ton of overlap there. And so there's modes of thought that definitely were being transmitted from the secular to the sacred in that. And we kind of started to resist this idea of even sharing the gospel because it was associated with Western culture. Ironically, because it didn't start in Western culture, you know, but because just
the vast majority of time
growth,
it has not been a Western idea.
It's but it definitely found a stronghold in Europe, in Western culture, and you know, if you read Vishal Mangawati, you know that it not only found a stronghold in Europe, it built Europe. It built the modern Western world that we're living in today. So it's not coincidence there. But we started making that association. White missionaries bad, indigenous peoples good, you know, because we didn't want to impose Western culture on them. We just wanted to get the gospel to them. But those are intertwined. Like Western culture is what it is because of the gospel, right? Now, there's some aspects and elements of Western culture that are just cultural. They have absolutely nothing to do with biblical values, you know. How we sing or the order of our church services or whatever. Like there's no biblical model or method for that. It's just a cultural expression, right? And if you want to, you know, if you need your church service to run 40 minutes so the people can get on with their lives, you know, Western culture, because everything is fast-paced, busy. Great, if that's the model that works. You go to warm culture climates, and they want a church service that lasts 5 and 6 hours. And for a Westerner, we're like, what is this sin? You know, we're like, I cannot take this. You know, there's something that just grates at us because it's so foreign
Yeah.
to what we have experienced in our culture. So yeah, there's cultural differences. But what we did was we just kind of reacted against this whole colonization model that political entities had been pushing for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah.
And because the church became guilty by association, and in some cases guilty because they were actually guilty, we pushed back against that whole model.
Yeah.
And therefore it gained a lot of prominent traction in academia.
Yeah.
And then college students, and so now, of course, DTS students are of college age who have either been to university, coming out of university, or are about to go in. Like, this is just, it's trickled down to society at large by this point, to where we have this antagonistic view of Western society, and that it's somehow detrimental or improper at best, sin at worst, that we would actually want to indoctrinate or push our views onto another culture. And we have to understand that, there's some truth to that. Like, we don't need to go and exactly duplicate a Western church service in the middle of India or Africa or the Middle East, like, because it's not going to be an indigenous vibe. It's not going to click with the people because they function slightly differently. They have, but at the same time, a large part of what we're taking to them is not Western culture. It's the gospel, which has influenced Western culture. And so we just have to be mindful of that. And you and I have been on the field a lot, and we understand that tension. Anywhere you go, you're fighting with that tension of, like, what is the gospel versus what is my culture.
Exactly.
And being able to separate the two without causing damage to either one, right? You don't want to look down or sneer upon Western culture, because it's a beautiful culture just like any other culture is, but you also don't want to make it sacrosanct. You don't want to make that part of the gospel.
Okay, everyone, I have to jump in here again for a brief second because I'm in the process of editing this video, and I realized I have to cut out an hour to an hour and a half of this teaching session, and there's a whole bunch of good stuff that you guys are missing. So what I'm gonna do is there's gonna be two versions of this video, the one you're watching right now, and then I'm also gonna make sure your school leader has access to the full unedited version. And if any of this interests you in any bit, I want to encourage you, get that unedited version from your school leader and dive a bit deeper into this. If you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me, and we'd love just to pull apart some more of this. But I just needed to interject that real quick, just so you know there's a lot missing here, but I want to make sure that you have access to all of it. So
it's good. Awesome. So again, my good friend Joshua Statham, I will make sure that all of you guys have access. I'm not just going to say it on here, but he does have a website. He does have a place where he is constantly posting different, putting up different blog posts, articles, everything that he's putting together, really pulling apart lots of his thoughts on what's currently happening in society now. How do we approach some of these key crucial topics that we need to be wrestling with? How do we approach them from a biblical perspective? And then, I mean, he's a missionary as well who's getting ready to head off onto the field. You can join the 2-language group soon. Come on. But it'll be good.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing, and for just opening up a little bit of this can of worms on this third wave. I mean, it really is a little bit more of one of those confusing waves for a lot of people to wrap their head around, because there's so much going on. But you did a great job unpacking some of these key points that I think we really need to benefit from.
It's a fun little puzzle box.
It is. Come on. Awesome. Well, tomorrow we've got wave number 4, and we'll step into a lot more of, yes, where are we currently, and a little bit of what's been happening as the development of this 4th wave has been coming about, but also where are we headed? That's where it gets real fun, and you guys will love Fred, so we'll step into that tomorrow. But have a great day.